Hello and welcome to WHRB News. I am here today with current Federal Communications Commission Chairman and Harvard alumnus Ajit Pai. Ajit, welcome to the show.
It's great to be with you.
Can you start by just telling me about your Harvard experience?
Great. So I was a class of the 94, so quite a while ago, almost quarter century. Started off in Wigglesworth freshman year, finished up in Cabot for the next 3 years. Social studies major, loved a lot of it, and wish I could go back and take some of the classes I should have taken way back when. It was a great experience, though. I mean, I grew up in a small town in Kansas, and to go to the world's best university and study from some of the leading scholars in all these fields was an incredible intellectual experience. And in addition to that, the extracurriculars I did were really meaningful to me, too. So I loved my time at Harvard.
You talked about your experience being from a small town and being first generation here at Harvard. Can you discuss that a little bit more and tell us what you think the university could do to improve?
That's a great question. So yeah, coming from a very small town, went to our local public high school. It was a culture shock in many ways to come to Cambridge and see these folks who were from much bigger cities than me, had much more fancy high school pedigrees than me. And I think one of the great things the university did was to make clear in individual classes and also even in our dorms through our residential advisors and the like, that look, you're all in the same playing field here. You all have the same opportunity to learn from some of the world's best scholars. You have the same opportunity to spend the same amount of hours studying. And I think that was a really eye-opening experience to me. Knowing that I could compete academically was fantastic. In terms of what the university could do better, I'm sure they're still continuing that tradition of making sure that everyone has a fair shot to succeed. I think the extracurriculars are really where Harvard shines. I mean, obviously the academic program is what it is, but to have the ability to extend to students, especially small town students like me, the chance to be on the debate team, the chance to write for the Harvard Political Review, the chance to act, the chance to perform if you're a violinist, for example, and you want to be a member of HRO. I mean, that's something that allows all of these kids who are coming from these small towns. All of them have some special talent, I'm sure, and you can really find a home for that talent at Harvard, and that's one of the great things about the university, I think.
And then how did you go from Harvard to FCC chairman, and what were some of the challenges along that path?
Certainly if you were to take a time machine back to 1994 and say, hey, 20-some years later, you're going to be tapped by the President of the United States to serve as a commissioner, and then as the chairman of this agency in Washington, I never would have believed you. I mean, I'm still at heart a small-town kid, and I feel almost like the Forrest Gump of the Harvard Alumni Club, and sort of ambling into this position. But I just had the chance to move to Washington 20 years ago this month, actually, and have the chance to serve in these really interesting positions. This is my 8th or 9th job out of law school. The opportunity to work on Capitol Hill, the Senate Judiciary Committee, the chance to work at the Department of Justice in the Antitrust Division, the chance to work here as a staff lawyer, a career lawyer, on some of the cutting-edge issues the agency was working on. Over time, I gained the right experience and had the bosses who were willing to vouch for me when the position became open. And I really feel extraordinarily blessed to have this privilege to serve. And I think part of it was just having that grounding at Harvard, the chance to study social studies, which gives you a very broad understanding of some of the basic forces in our society, history and economics and sociology and political science. Those kinds of things really have served me well throughout my career, and including now here at the FCC.
That's awesome. Now I want to just dive into policy issues because we don't have too much time. Can we first get a general overview of your light touch approach and how you determine when it is appropriate and necessary to apply government regulations on media?
Yeah, so my basic philosophy is that the market, the free market, has delivered far more value for consumers over time than preemptive regulation does. Now, that's not to say that regulation doesn't have a role. I think where there's a market failure or there are concrete examples of anti-competitive conduct, then I think the government has to step in and make sure that there is a level playing field for competitors and for consumers. But by and large, what we see is, even here at the FCC, that the markets have been very successful. The best example of that is spectrum policy, the wireless airwaves that are used. For many years, the agency doled it out on a preferred basis to the broadcasters or the wireless companies that it preferred. But in 1993, Congress told the FCC, no, consider the market as an alternative way of distributing this asset, this public resource. So we started auctioning off this spectrum, and the results speak for themselves. The wireless revolution took off at precisely the moment when the FCC embraced the markets, and now everyone is carrying around a smartphone in their pocket, using it for ever more advanced applications and services. That's precisely because we embraced the market as opposed to the government being the best allocator of these resources. In terms of media, I am a strong supporter of the First Amendment. I think that broadcasters, including college broadcasters like you, should have the freedom to do what they do best, which is to inform their listeners or inform their viewers in the case of television in the way they see fit. And I think that's one of the hallmarks of our democracy is we don't have the government sitting as a gatekeeper deciding what you can and can't broadcast to your viewers and to your listeners. We let you make that decision and let consumers make an informed decision on their own about whether they want to listen or watch.
Sounds great. So we'll get into the specifics of the case that made you very famous just about a year ago.
Or infamous, depending on your point of view.
Got to dive right into it. What exactly was it that you changed? I know you changed about 2/3 of the net neutrality policy. What did you change, and why do you think it was necessary to change it, despite the popularity that net neutrality seemed to have?
Yeah, so I think net neutrality is a very seductive marketing slogan, but when you peel back the layers of the onion, you look at what the FCC actually did, it's a very arcane decision. So from the dawn of the internet in the mid-1990s until 2015, the internet was classified by the FCC under both Democrats and Republicans as an information service. The FCC changed that in 2015 to call it a telecommunications service. We simply restored it back to what it was before. And the reason why we did it is we want the internet to scale in accordance with consumers' wishes. So for consumers nowadays, for example, are focused much more on things like streaming video and virtual reality and the like. We need the infrastructure to be able to scale accordingly to match that consumer demand. But you can't have that if you heavily regulate the internet like a slow-moving utility, regulating it like Amtrak, for example, or having the FCC regulate it as quickly as it regulates the DMV. That's not the kind of thing we want for this dynamic infrastructure space. And so we decided to lightly regulate the internet, backed up by Federal Trade Commission enforcement. So we have an FCC transparency requirement. Every internet service provider has to disclose all kinds of business practices to us. If they don't, that's an FCC violation. And the Federal Trade Commission can target any company, big or small, in any part of the country that behaves in an anti-competitive way. And it can and will take action against that company for harming consumers. So consumers will continue to be protected as they were prior to 2015. And we're going to have the infrastructure investment that we need to deliver next generation services to online consumers.
So I was wondering, is there any concrete evidence that these regulations were actually causing decreased investment in infrastructure? And why haven't the cutbacks yet shown investment increases? Is that an issue of the market, or is that an issue of the policy change?
So we did see concrete evidence from a number of companies, especially smaller companies. For example, Paladin Wireless in Royston, Georgia, a very tiny company, told us they had spent $8,000 simply on compliance costs. And $8,000 might not seem like a lot, except that when you consider that in this very small town, it could have been used to connect many more consumers to the internet. We got sworn declarations from many small companies in places like Little Rock, Arkansas, who told us that they had to spend money complying with these regulations. On a larger level, we saw an aggregate decrease in investment in infrastructure of 5.6%. The first time we've ever seen that outside of a recession. Now, going forward, what we've seen is that after this decision was made, there were positive signs in terms of infrastructure investment. We've gotten some preliminary data, for example, that suggests that investment has been up in the first 6 months of 2018 compared to where it was in the years before. So hopefully we'll continue to see that positive trend. And in the meantime, we want to ensure that consumers are going to continue to be protected both at the FCC and at the Federal Trade Commission.
So what do you think it was about the marketing of this change that made it go so viral and make it seem so unpopular, at least over the mainstream media? What do you think happened that caused that?
I think some of it was the deliberate misinformation that was peddled out there by activists, by politicians, and others who had a stake in this. For example, if you tell people Ajit Pai is about to destroy the internet, or Ajit Pai is about to make you pay $5 per tweet, or Ajit Pai is going to slow down your internet on purpose. I mean, these are the kinds of things that if you don't have the time or the interest in studying the nuances of Title II versus Title I regulation of the internet, it seems very appealing and disturbing to hear that kind of information, and so you're naturally going to oppose it. But I think once you have the chance to study the issue, and once you have a chance to experience what the internet has been like over the past 5 months, I mean, this repeal has been in effect since June. The internet hasn't ended. You haven't had to pay $5 per tweet. All of these portents of doom were completely overblown, and I think consumers are coming to recognize that. And so, again, once you let the hysteria and misinformation fade into the background, and you focus on what consumers' core concern is, it's for getting more internet access out there, getting more competition. And the way to do that is with a market-based approach that we have embraced. And look, I've now visited 41 states and the territories of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. I have never heard anybody say our primary concern or our experience has been that our ISP has been blocking content willy-nilly. Instead, it's that, look, we want better, faster, cheaper internet. That's exactly what this FCC is committed to delivering to them, including with things like 5G wireless service and approving applications from companies like SpaceX to get better internet out there. Those are the kinds of things that consumers are actually concerned about.
And then last really quick question on this. If net neutrality is so popular, why can't Congress pass net neutrality regulations into law? Why does this have to be left to the FCC?
Oh, I would love for Congress to step in and put on the page some rules for the digital age. It's been 22 years since Congress spoke with a bipartisan voice during the Clinton administration. In 1996, they said the internet should be, quote, unfettered by federal and state regulation. I would love for Congress to come in and set general rules for the road that all of us agree with. None of us want to see ISPs blocking content. None of us want to see throttling of content. We want companies to behave transparently. In addition, we want the entire internet economy to respect consumers' privacy and other things like that. And so I think Congress is going to take a serious interest in this in the next couple of years. And I would hope in a bipartisan way they'll be able to forge a compact for consumers in the 21st century that matches the accomplishment that was done in the 20th century.
So one more policy issue I want to touch on is the issue of social media's towing the line between public forums and content providers. With the recent moves of banning Alex Jones and others, many of the major social media platforms have taken a big step away from the idea of being just a platform. At the same time, the criticism about allowing hate speech is louder than ever. What do you think this means for their status in the eyes of the FCC? And do you trust these companies, which control the majority of communications worldwide, to fairly regulate content and uphold the nation's values of free speech?
Well, I'll put it this way. About a year ago, when I was introducing our reforms on internet regulation, I pointed out that these tech platforms are some of the most incredibly concentrated and profound platforms in the digital economy, and they're completely unregulated. They make decisions in a non-transparent way, and in many cases, they do stifle free speech, including from people that we might not agree with. And I think that's one of the things that Congress is now taking a look at. How do we respect consumers' privacy at a time when, for example, the Android platform has an 88% market share, is monitoring you even when the phone is off, and is being used in conjunction with your Google searches and other things to monetize your personal information? That's something that's unregulated. I think it's ironic, actually, that WHRB is actually more highly regulated than Google and Facebook and some of these tech giants. It's absurd on its face to suggest that a college broadcast station should be singled out for regulation at the FCC, whereas these tech giants, Google alone, for example, has a market cap greater than Comcast, Facebook, AT&T, Verizon, and Charter combined, along with the GDP of Sweden. They face lighter regulation than you do as a college radio broadcaster. Is that fair? I'm not sure that it is, and I think that Congress is going to be taking a serious look at that, including how they actually exercise editorial control over these platforms.
Thanks so much for that. Can I run down a list of other new media technologies and just get some rapid-fire thoughts on them?
Sure thing.
Let's go with virtual reality.
I think it's exciting. I remember Lawnmower Man, this movie from the early 90s that kind of opened my eyes to the promise of virtual reality, and we're almost there, especially with the dawn of 5G. I think with things like robotic surgery that's done remotely and other applications, I mean, obviously gaming is the big one, VR and AR are going to be huge.
Self-driving cars.
Oh, it's tremendous. As someone who grew up with a 1979 Caprice Classic, it blows my mind that we're talking about self-driving cars. But just imagine about the social changes it's going to. I mean, many, many more hours of free time you could devote to something productive. That you won't need to have garages anymore or driveways. That's going to be a huge change to the way homes are constructed. It's going to be a huge first and second order transformation of society.
3D printing.
Tremendous. I still remember that story from a few years ago when they forgot to bring a part up to the International Space Station, and from LA they just beamed up a 3D schematic of it and they just printed it out at the space station. That's a huge thing, and it reduces the barriers for manufacturing in a really profound way and empowers anybody to be his or her own manufacturer.
Artificial intelligence. I know that's a particularly big one for you.
Oh, this is going to be tremendous. In fact, on Friday, November 30th, we're going to be hosting a forum on AI and machine learning here at the FCC. I think this is the technology that's going to transform society more than any other in so many different ways. It's going to change the nature of work. It's going to make us much more efficient. It's going to have effects on all of these verticals from healthcare to agriculture. This is what I think a lot of people are going to be focused on more than any of the other technologies we've talked about so far.
And with all these new technologies, what are some potential threats you see on the horizon, and how might the FCC deal with them?
I think some of the threats are that any of these new technologies can be used for ill, not just for good. And so AI and machine learning, for example, some foreign governments have suggested or are in fact thinking about using it in order to monitor their citizens and to structure the behavior in a way that the state deems fit. And that's something that I think most freedom-loving people would be disturbed by. I think those are the types of things that we need to be on guard against here in the United States. And from an FCC perspective, I think the carrying forth that ethos of the First Amendment and other constitutional protections, we want these technologies to be devoted in order to promote freedom, not to restrict it. And that's one of the things that regulators and policymakers will have to be concerned about.
So now I only have two more questions. I would like to look into a new controversial case you've been recently looking into over regulations surrounding text message. People are saying it's similar to net neutrality. What do you think is going to happen moving forward? Is it at all similar? Can you give us a little bit background about that?
Yeah, so the number one complaint we get at the FCC is actually about robocalls and the like.
I get 100 a day.
It's unbelievable. And so one of the reasons why we don't see as many complaints about robotexts is that companies have a different regulatory framework that they've applied to block some of these unwanted spam texts and the like. But by classifying robotext as a telecommunications service, we would essentially open the door potentially to all of these spam texts flooding our phones, just as spam calls have been doing that. So to guard against that, we are simply saying that as a legal matter, we believe that text messaging is an information service, a lightly regulated service. That's historically the way the FCC has thought about it, going back 20 years to the Stevens report that the Clinton FCC released in 1998. And all we are doing is simply clarifying that we don't want this to be essentially a commodity under Title II. Now, some of the advocates on the other side would say, well, no, this is a net neutrality fight. We want every single text message to be delivered, and we don't want companies to be standing as gatekeepers. But our point is, the consumer concern is that we don't want our phones to be flooded with these spam texts, and the way to combat against that is by lightly regulating it as an information service. Another arcane debate that I think it makes people's eyes glaze over, but at the end of the day, what consumers need to know is that we are going to try to keep their phones as free as possible from unwanted communications, whether it's a voice call or a text message.
And last question, since this is a radio station, can you end by giving a closing insight on the future of radio?
I love radio. I'm honestly jealous that you've got this opportunity. I should have been focused on WHRB when I was an undergrad. It's one of the great stations in the country, one of only 4, as I understand it, that are still totally undergrad run, and it's a fantastic example, I think, of the power of radio. One of the great media that we've ever had. It's older than the FCC itself, going back to the 1920s, and one of the 3 things I love about radio is that it's universal. 93% of Americans from the ages of 18 to 49 still tune into the radio at least twice a week. And that's because radio is really one of the things that links us together as a community. You're distributing information that people want, and you're also receiving feedback from the community in a way that is unparalleled. And so I think the future of radio is really bright. The distribution platform might change. It might be on a phone, for example, over an app like TuneIn, or over an FM chip that hopefully smartphone manufacturers will activate so you can get radio in a different way. But nonetheless, there's something special about that medium and something special about the work that you do as a broadcaster that I think it really binds people together. And so I just want to thank you and all the great radio folks out there. It's one of the joys I have when I travel is popping into these stations and seeing, under the hood, so to speak. And it's an inspiration to people like me who, not just as a regulator, but as a citizen who grew up with radio, to see what radio broadcasters do each and every day.
Well, thank you for being here with us on the radio. FCC Chairman and Harvard alumnus Ajit Pai. You are listening to WHRB News, and have a wonderful rest of your Sunday afternoon.
Hey, you too, and go Crimson.
Go Crimson. Have a great day.